Hello and welcome to The First Draft, a new podcast by the Foreign Policy Research Institute in which we'll examine the ideas emanating from world affairs over the next few months. I'm Robert Kaplan, Robert Strauss Houppé Chair in Geopolitics.
And I'm Dominic Green, Senior Fellow in the FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West.
Dominic, let me start this off. You had an absolutely brilliant essay in the Wall Street Journal about King Charles III's coronation, where you said that the most important part of it the public did not see. Can you explain that and why it was in secret, so to speak?
Well, thank you, Robert. Yes, I was writing about the anointing of the king. And this is the most important part, and it's also hidden. In 1953, for Elizabeth II's anointing, they had a little canopy held over her head, like something used to crown a prince or king in India. In this case, Charles commissioned a three-part screen, which was carried into place with the sort of bumbling inefficiency which marked the whole thing as people shuffled about carrying golden spoons and pieces of regalia. And then Charles, having stripped down to a simple linen vest, was anointed with holy oil on his wrists, chest, and head. And this is in emulation of the anointing of Solomon by Zadok the priest. And indeed, the music beforehand was Handel's Zadok the priest, which is, of course, of slightly more recent vintage. The ritual itself is fascinating, not just because of its antiquity, but also, I feel, of what it tells us about how political authority is made and what really are the ultimate sources of political legitimacy. And in this case, you could clearly see a miniature version of the history, really, of political authority, which emerges out of religion, that from the early Bronze Age kingdoms onwards, having a license, a divine license, as we say, is foundational to political authority. And in our time, when we talk of political authority purely as being a secular thing, that suggests that we are, as it were, merely living in the top layer of a very deep cake. And indeed, if you look at some parts of the world, for instance, the Middle East in recent decades, you can see an ongoing crisis of political legitimacy where post-colonial states have struggled to establish credibility compared, for instance, to the institutions of religion.
Well, that's fascinating because if you look at the Middle East, the most stable and least oppressive regimes are all monarchies. Morocco, Jordan, Oman, the Gulf Sheikdoms, Saudi Arabia, they all have legitimacy, so they don't have to be that cruel most of the time, that is. And also, they have a certain quality about them. You know, it's because the monarchy does not have to prove itself. So it's just there. You know, it has an inbred legitimacy so that, you know, it eliminates a certain level of cruelty, unlike in the secular Republican regimes of Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, and Assad. So, you know, what you said about King Charles III links up with this phenomenon in the Middle East, that there is still something that has to be magical about political authority for it to be accepted and therefore not to be overly cruel. I mean, even the United States, you know, take away the governmental part of the president, but as head of state, you know, there's a certain magic with the marching bands, the flyovers, all of that. So what you're saying is, you know, is very relevant, I think, to today, that purely secular regimes, you know, purely Republican regimes have a harder time, you know, generally. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I do. And one of the things, again, part of the bumbling nature of the coronation, at some point it was suggested beforehand that everybody who was watching on television could join in And what had previously been an oath taken by the peerage, the lords and bishops of the House of Lords, could now be called the oath of the people, which does actually sound like something from a totalitarian regime. And this was received with mockery, in that most of the people in Britain recognized it was none of the Archbishop of Canterbury's business to ask them to give an oath of loyalty or assent, that this entire question of legitimacy has been parked in the very vague and entertaining spectacles of something like a coronation. And I think you're right that a system where legitimacy is separated constitutionally from politics, or simply beyond the realm of politics, is less likely to enforce good behavior, to demand oaths of loyalty. And it's true also that this British state that we were looking at in many ways came into existence by demanding oaths of loyalty in the 17th century on specifically religious grounds. But that's a long time back, yeah.
To be blunt, politics needs a certain degree of magic in order to work.
Yeah, I would say so. Otherwise, you see nothing less than the operations of self-interest. And it is the magic, I suspect, which by placing everybody on an equally humble footing before the mystery of how authority is created, actually has a strange leveling effect. And of course, there are endless, often quite tiresome anecdotes about kings and queens who mingle with the people and engage in some kind of democratic equality with them, usually in the lighter forms of banter. But in practical terms, I think there is something to be said with this. A monarchy necessarily operates within limits, not because kings are absolute monarchs or constitutional ones, but because the monarchy is therefore responsible for something much larger than the king. And the absence of limits is perhaps a design flaw in Republican systems, because it encourages overweening ambitions.
Yeah, and again, you can see that in the Middle East between the failed Ba'athist regimes, the Gaddafi regimes, and yet the far, far more humane, yet more deeply respected royal systems, that are not democratic, but yet there's a social contract between ruler and ruled, whereby the rulers promise stable, legitimate government, and those ruled promise not to question authority at the highest level.
In a way, those are both negative promises, aren't they? To not overreach the office and to not overreach your position. The modern Western system is premised on positives, isn't it? Especially in the American one, with the right to pursue happiness, if not.
Right. So why don't we move on, and staying in Britain, to the New Statesman, which had a roundtable discussion, which went several rounds that I initiated, which they titled The Age of Tragedy. But tragedy being something different than most people understand it. It's not about terrible things that happen. It's about thinking tragically in order to avoid tragedy, a sort of like constructive pessimism, if you will. And I started off the discussion by saying that the world today is like the Weimar Republic. It's a larger version of Weimar. And what happened, because of communications, telecommunications, technology, we're all united, not in a government, in a world government, or even in world governance, but in a world system where any part can tweak the other parts. And therefore, there is always going to be some instability or crisis somewhere that affects everybody. And that's why we need to maintain this sense of constructive pessimism. You can deal with it in terms of climate change, in terms of authoritarian rulers, wars, whatever. And then you contributed to it.
Yes, this is true. Yes, it's coming out, I think, in mid to late May. I think there. I mean, there are several. There were three of you, obviously, talking in the initial symposium.
Yes, I should mention their names: John Gray, the British philosopher, and Helen Thompson, who is a professor at Cambridge University.
The thing that struck me was this. Obviously, I mean, I agree very much with the need for pessimistic realism and as a path to some kind of optimism about a manageable future. The thing that struck me particularly is we do actually have the means to reduce key points of tension that I think all three of you identified in the seminar. One of them is the question of population. This is and Malthus, of course, was a spectre as always, as he has been for 200 years. In fact, in the mid 20th century, there were various technological improvements and inventions made which allowed us to support a hugely enlarged global population, and by just about any measure, extreme poverty has decreased sharply in recent decades. So it seemed to me that population can probably be managed. And not only that, of course, there is data suggesting that later in this century, we'll be looking at a declining global population. And the structural challenges we will face, therefore, should be considered in two ways when we talk about population. How to manage the final phase of population increase, which looks now to be around 15% perhaps ahead of where we are now at 8 billion. And then how to manage the other side of the mountain, because population in some estimates may start peaking around 2050, because degrowth in population is going to have all kinds of economic and political consequences, particularly making the tax base on which the welfare state rests. And on that also rests the social happiness and the legitimacy of modern Western democracies.
Yes. See, what I pointed out in the essay is that Malthus, for hundreds of years, has over and over again been proven wrong. And I asked, if he's so wrong, why is it necessary to keep proving him wrong every decade and every century? Maybe at some deep level, philosophical level, Malthus is right in this sense that he was the first Enlightenment philosopher to really link man in an ecosystem, that human beings were not just creatures in a test tube that didn't operate in a natural physical environment. By bringing the natural physical environment into the argument, he inexorably enriched the whole discussion. And as for his mistake about population, he reevaluated it 6 times during his lifetime, and ultimately it was still wrong. But we shouldn't judge him by that one mistake. You know, philosophers are often great not for the questions they answer, but for the questions they raise, which is still very relevant. So in a sense, the very fact that we're talking about population, about climate change, about world poverty means we're still in a Malthusian age, you know.
I would agree. And let's face it, Malthus has been proved right at a regional level many times over. If you look at the rise in commodity prices and basic foodstuffs such as bread that prefaced the Arab Spring, for instance, that's a classic Malthusian trap. And we would seem to be in one now if you look at the rise which has occurred caused by the war in Ukraine and its effect on wheat pricing, for instance. You know, it's not that Malthus's theory is wrong. It's more that we have managed to contain the effects of the Malthusian theory at a global level, when we actually haven't managed to contain them regionally frequently. In fact, so it's not like it's not been tested and found wanting. It's actually been tested and found successful. It's more the macro application of it on a global scale that we've managed to hold off by technological ingenuity. And another question which I noticed came up in all of the 3 pieces in this New Statesman symposium was about energy as a key friction point in this global Weimar. And again, I wondered if it's possible to take some of the edge off that friction. For instance, we're in the early stages of an energy revolution now, and there are contradictory forces at work in the Western democracies. I feel that there is an enormous push from private industry for innovation. Yet there is also an enormous distrust of innovation in general, coming from the most educated, interestingly enough, parts of the middle class. There's a powerful anti-industrial, almost Luddite movement, which would like us to switch off the lights forever. But that seems to me to be likely to condemn, firstly, most of the world's population to Malthusian hell, and secondly, all of us to a much worse future, because we are all in it together. So again, energy management and energy ingenuity seem to me to be the only sane path forward in this situation.
Yes, and I think, as Professor Thompson of Cambridge pointed out, also Daniel Yergin, the great energy expert, have pointed out, switching to electric cars and all that means is, instead of the world of big oil, we'll be in the world of big shovel, digging up and scouring the earth for rare earths and other minerals that will be needed for the mass production of electric cars and other things. Either way, it's hard to escape from digging up the earth, in one form or another.
Yes, and if it's not that, certainly when it comes to the massive need for domestic energy, it's big nuclear is ultimately the backstop, because, as the Northern Europeans can report, solar energy tends to rely upon there being enough sun. So I wanted to ask you, from a theoretical point of view, in the realist school of foreign policy analysis, the idea is that a single hegemon can stabilize the system. And so I have two questions. One, do you agree? And two, what does that mean for where we are now, which is such a time of transition?
Well, it's true that historically, unipolar world orders and even bipolar world orders have been more stable than multipolar world orders, because multipolar world orders are more complex and therefore more things can go wrong, especially in a Weimar age where everything is connected everywhere. So we're one big fragile system, so to speak. But I think that we're headed into a world, and this gets us into Ukraine, where all three great powers, the US, China, Russia, and lesser powers like Iran, are all in their own very individual ways in decline. But because some are declining faster than others, some have relative advantages. I think Iran and Russia, the regimes there, are in the quickest decline. But I think China has a lot of problems that are masked by its authoritarian system. And the US has a lot of problems which are just out in the open, which have to do with a sort of civil war without the shooting, so to speak. But I think we're at a fork in the road now, because this summer's counteroffensive by the Ukrainians has the potential to really defeat Russia. And by defeating Russia, what I mean is it would take back substantial amount of territory and be in a position to permanently threaten militarily Crimea. And if Crimea is threatened or really becomes fragile, Putin could be out of power, because Crimea is not Eastern Ukraine. Russians care about Crimea going back to Catherine the Great. It strikes a real emotional chord in the Russian psyche, Crimea. And so, if the Ukrainians do very well and Putin is threatened, we're going to see a lot of voices saying that democracy is triumphing around the world. But I would put it differently. If we have this fortunate result of Ukraine really besting Russia, it will mean that the democratic experiment in Europe has now expanded to Ukraine. In other words, we're finishing up the business of the original Cold War, but this says very little about the Middle East or Africa or Southeast Asia. Because if you remember, after the Cold War, everyone said now the world will become democratic. And of course it didn't, because Poland had very little to do with Nigeria or Sierra Leone, so to speak. And I think by autumn, we may be making the same mistake by saying that because of a fortunate, heading in the right direction in Ukraine militarily has implications for the whole world, which it may not.
This month, we've also been watching the elections in Turkey.
Yes.
This is not being received in the West as a heartwarming exercise in democracy and its spread or maintenance. In fact, the surprisingly successful showing of Erdogan has caused quite a lot of alarm.
Yeah, you can see it in the New York Times headlines, because for days and days, the headlines were, in effect, Erdogan is in deep trouble. We may be facing a new brighter future Turkey in the coming days. In 96 hours, Turkey may look like a much more positive example of democracy. And then when the results came in, there was like a silence. Erdogan beat his second best rival by 4.5 points. And according to Eurasia Group now, has a 70 to 80% chance of winning the second round. And I should say I do some work for Eurasia Group, just as, just to disclose that. But Eurasia Group did say that, and now I see other commentators coming around to the position it's going to be difficult for the opposition to win, so that we may be back with Erdogan for another few years.
One of the things you discuss in The Tragic Mind is the need for a certain humility before events and a recognition of the limits of human capacity. If we were to see Vladimir Putin displaced as the leader of Russia, or if Erdogan was no longer the president of Turkey, how much real difference would this make to the big shifts which are going on? Because the map is still the same and the territory is much the same. Powers rising, powers falling, and so on. The weakening of Europe's share of global GDP, for instance, is not going to be greatly affected by shifts in the frontiers of democracy in Europe.
Yes. Look, when Vladimir Putin was indicted as a war criminal by the International Court at The Hague, there was an implicit assumption in that indictment that there will be a post-Putin Russia and it will be benign. And both, and those assumptions may not be correct. Eventually there will be a post-Putin Russia, as we all know, but it may not be so benign. It may be chaotic. It may be more nationalistic. It may be harder to predict, And remember, we're talking about a state with immense amounts of nuclear weapons, both strategic and tactical. So that's one problem. The other problem is that Ukraine, with its, I think, 44 million people or something close to that, is going to be a hard thing to swallow for NATO and the EU. I mean, they will do it. They will do it, and they will put the best, bravest face on it. But it will add a real strain to the, to European organizations. So even if Ukraine does very well this summer, which I expect they will, on the battlefield, the problems will continue. But the media loves symbolism. And the symbolism of Ukraine besting Russia on the battlefield and the symbolism of Putin being on the ropes and weak is going to cause the media to claim that democracy is on the march everywhere now. Forget about Sudan, forget about Afghanistan, forget about the failure in Tunisia, which is relatively recent. Forget about how Foreign Affairs put it last week. Nigeria is on the boil, so to speak. So it will continue to be a messy world.
Historically, of course, the price for stabilizing the frontiers between spheres of influence is that the smaller peoples get squashed or divided or sold out when it comes to the negotiations.
Yes, exactly. Well, we have a few more minutes left. And maybe let me just shift to your book of the week, book of the month rather, on Orwell, correct?
Yes, my book of the month this month is Orwell: A New Life by D.J. Taylor, who in 2003 wrote Orwell: A Life. This is most definitely, though, the new life in that it really uses what must be the final pieces of the archival jigsaw in that he's located love letters, which, of course, in Orwell is the coldest of cold fish. It's amazing that there are even love letters to be excavated. And he also tracked down 10, I think, people he found who actually knew Orwell, which, given that Orwell died in 1950, is quite astonishing. Yeah. And they include his son, Richard, who I wasn't aware was still with us, and I hope still is at the time of broadcast. It's a tremendous book. And it really focuses not just on Orwell's emotional life, but how emotional his politics were, because he called himself a democratic socialist. He fought with a Trotskyite militia in Spain. He was very comfortable in the company of anarchists, who are always highly theoretical in their politics. But actually, his conception of socialism, and indeed the conception of what politics should be about struck me as owing more to Mazzini and the 19th century romantics than to Marx and Engels. He said when he was on his deathbed, and he was on it for a long time, for several months, because he had tuberculosis. He said that the fundamental political problem is how to make people behave decently if they no longer believe in God. And it's almost exactly a word-for-word statement of Mazzini in letters from the 1840s. So I thought this was a brilliant book for two reasons. One of us showing someone we think we know in a completely new light and adding a great deal of depth, but also because in turn it shed perhaps light on why it is that Orwell is so much a part of current debates, a reference point now, in the way that most critics and writers of the mid-20th century simply aren't.
Well, that was great. I'm not going to give you a book. I'm going to give you a short film that I saw. And it was extraordinarily inspiring. It's about the 50-year relationship between the journalist Robert Caro and the New York editor Robert Gottlieb, both of whom are legendary, and both of whom have been engaged with each other over one project for half a century, which is Robert Caro's multi-volume, and each volume is massive, study of power using Lyndon Johnson. And what's amazing about it is it takes you back to an older form of editing, where everything is on paper, paper is exchanged, writing is put in. There's none of these track changes or any of this other, what I consider to be nonsense, things that just
the nightmare. Yes.
Yeah, they're a nightmare. They give you headaches, all of that. This is like older editing. And I must say that I still do that with my editor, my young editor at Random House. We exchange papers with writing in the margin and all of that. But look, the thing is, Caro is 87, and he's finishing the final volume. So how does an 87-year-old man have so much energy to write all day, every day, to finish this? I think there's a trick to it that came out in the film, and the trick is he almost puts this as an aside, that Caro doesn't do any devices, no electronics, no technology. He has other people who do that for him. He lives in a world where he writes it out longhand, and then when he thinks he's got it about right, he goes to a Remington electric typewriter and types it out. And then he doesn't see it again. To put into electronic form and all of that, other people do. So he's completely free of the anxieties and the time-wasting nature of digital cyber technology, which eats away so much of our energy, in my opinion.
That's fascinating, and I think it's very true, because it makes us into our own editors, permanently turning back and fixing on the minutiae, when in fact the really important stuff, for instance, the establishment of a political chronology, gets lost.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a brilliant film. It's very inspiring. It makes you love being a writer or an editor, in the old-fashioned sense. So that's all the time we have this month, and we'll look forward to continuing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to The First Draft on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts to be notified about new episodes. To explore more podcasts and upcoming events, please visit us on www.fpri.org.